In July of this year, a single number tore through the tech internet like wildfire. Windows, the operating system running on more computers than any other in the history of computing, had fallen below 60% market share. Not slipped, not dipped slightly. Collapsed, according to the headlines, dropping more than 22 percentage points in just 2 months. Linux. Fan sites shared it instantly. Influencers posted screenshots with captions declaring Microsoft's decades-long dominance was finally cracking. For about a week, this number was treated as gospel truth across the entire internet. It was wrong, not slightly wrong, not a rounding error. The real number, once properly corrected, was closer to 72%, meaning the entire viral collapse never actually happened at all. This is the story of how one of the biggest tech statistics of the year turned out to be a data classification glitch, why almost nobody caught it before it went viral, and what the real, much less dramatic truth actually looks like underneath all the noise. This is exactly the kind of story this channel has to get right, even when getting it right means walking back some of the excitement. We've spent this entire year building a case, video after video, that Windows is facing genuine documented pressure. Hardware, lockouts, broken developer tools, real lawsuits, real government migrations away from its ecosystem. Every one of those stories held up under scrutiny because we checked them before publishing them. This story is a test of that same discipline, applied to a number that would have been the single most dramatic headline of the entire year, if only it had been true. Let's start with the number itself, because the scale of the apparent collapse is what made it spread so fast in the first place, faster than almost any other desktop computing statistic this entire year. In April of 2026, the analytics firm StatCounter, one of the most widely cited sources for global operating system market share, pulling data from over 1.5 million websites and billions of page views, reported Windows sitting at roughly 79% of the global desktop market. 2 months later, in June, that same company's headline table showed Windows had crashed all the way down to 56.55%. Do the math on that, and you get a drop of over 22 percentage points, a relative decline of nearly 28% in just 60 days. For a company that has dominated desktop computing for over 3 decades, that kind of number isn't a decline, it's an earthquake. And the story got even juicier from there, exactly the kind of detail that makes a viral claim spread even faster. The same June data showed Linux climbing to 4.39%, one of its strongest showings in years. It showed a combined macOS and OS X figure sitting at over 16%. Put those numbers side by side with Windows' apparent collapse, and you get exactly the kind of narrative that spreads like fire on social media. The empire is falling, and the underdogs are finally winning. Linux news sites ran with headlines declaring Windows had dropped under 60% for the first time in years. Tech influencers posted the screenshot on social media with captions, warning that Windows' reputation might finally be catching up with it. For a few days, this was simply accepted as fact by a huge portion of the tech community, including plenty of people who should have known better. Here's where the story takes its first genuinely surprising turn, and it's the detail that unravels everything the viral headline claimed. Buried inside that same StatCounter dataset was a category most casual readers scrolled straight past, something simply labeled unknown. And in June 2026, that unknown category had exploded at 21.45% of all measured traffic, up from just 9.17% the year before. Read that again. More than 1 in every 5 desktop visits StatCounter measured that month couldn't be identified as any operating system at all. Not Windows, not Linux, not macOS, just unknown. That single detail is the entire key to unraveling this whole story, and almost nobody who shared the viral screenshot bothered to look at it. StatCounter doesn't actually count physical devices or verified installations. It identifies operating systems by reading something called a browser's user agent string, a small piece of text your browser sends to every website you visit, announcing what operating system and browser version you're running. If that string is missing, modified, blocked by a privacy setting, or altered by newer browser privacy features that increasingly strip out identifying details by default, StatCounter simply can't tell what operating system that visit came from. It gets dumped into the unknown bucket instead. And that bucket had just ballooned by more than 12 full percentage points in a single year. Here's the detail that should have stopped every single viral headline in its tracks before it ever got published. If you went to StatCounter's own website and clicked the download button to grab the raw CSV file behind that headline chart, the unknown category simply wasn't in it. The site automatically recalculated every percentage using only the visits it could actually identify. And in that recalculated file, sitting right there for anyone willing to click one button, Windows wasn't at 56.55%. It was back at approximately 72%. The exact same dataset, the exact same month, produced two wildly different headlines. Numbers depending entirely on whether you counted the unidentified traffic as its own operating system or excluded it entirely. Nobody sharing the viral screenshot had bothered to check. Independent researchers and tech journalists did the math themselves once the discrepancy started raising eyebrows, and the arithmetic behind it is almost embarrassingly simple once you actually sit down and do it, which is exactly what almost nobody sharing the original screenshot bothered to try. Take the reported Windows figure of 56.61%, divide it by the percentage of traffic that was actually identifiable, 100% minus that 21.40% unknown chunk, which leaves 78.55%. 56.61 divided by 78.55 gives you almost exactly 72%. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It's the same data run through two different denominators, producing headline numbers that differ by a staggering 15 percentage points, depending entirely on which version a journalist happened to grab first. So which number is actually real? This is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable for anyone hoping for a simple, satisfying answer, because the honest response is that both numbers are technically true and both are dangerously misleading on their own, depending entirely on what question you're actually trying to answer with them. If you count every unidentifiable visit as belonging to some mysterious, undefined operating system, Windows sits at 56.6%. If you only count the traffic that could actually be positively identified, Windows sits at roughly 72%. Neither number should ever be published or shared without the other sitting right next to it, and virtually nobody who spread this story bothered to include both. It's worth being clear about what almost certainly caused this specific spike in unidentifiable traffic, because the explanation itself is a genuinely interesting story about how the modern web is quietly changing. Privacy-focused browser updates have increasingly started stripping detailed version information out of user agent strings by default, specifically to make it harder for websites to fingerprint and track individual users across the internet. That's a genuinely good thing for user privacy. But it comes with an unintended side effect. Analytics tools like StatCounter, which have relied on detailed user agent parsing for literally decades to identify operating systems, are increasingly running into traffic they simply can't classify anymore. Not because those users switched away from Windows, but because their browser is deliberately telling websites less information than it used to. And here's the detail that should make you deeply skeptical of any single month's dramatic swing in this kind of data going forward. Because this wasn't even StatCounter's first rodeo with exactly this kind of statistical mirage. Back in September of 2025, the very same company's data appeared to show Windows 7, an operating system that officially lost all security support back in 2020 and has a global user base that should be shrinking, not growing, suddenly spiking to nearly 10% market share, up from under 1% just weeks earlier. That number was absurd on its face. Windows 7 did not experience a sudden global renaissance in the fall of 2025. Nobody woke up that September and decided, en masse, to downgrade a decade-old operating system with zero security. Patches left. StatCounter quietly corrected the figures afterward, and Windows 7 sank right back down below 1%, exactly where it belonged the whole time. The exact same pattern, an implausible, headline-grabbing statistical spike, followed by a quiet correction weeks later that generated a fraction of the attention the original wrong number did, had already played out once before, less than a year earlier, and almost nobody drew the connection when it happened again with this Windows collapse story. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it means this isn't a one-time fluke in StatCounter's methodology. It's a recurring vulnerability in how this specific data source handles unusual traffic patterns, one that's now produced two separate viral false headlines within roughly a 12-month window. Anyone treating a single month of StatCounter data as gospel without checking whether it holds up against the previous month's trend line or against a second independent source is building their understanding of the entire desktop operating system landscape on a foundation that has already cracked at least twice in under a year. That pattern matters enormously because it reveals something uncomfortable about how viral text statistics actually spread in the internet age. A shocking, dramatic number gets published. It fits a narrative people already want to believe, in this case, that Windows dominance is finally crumbling and Linux is surging. It gets shared thousands of times within hours by accounts with genuine influence and large followings. The correction, when it eventually comes, is slower, less dramatic, buried in a follow-up article nobody reads with nearly the same enthusiasm as the original bombshell. By the time the real story catches up, the false version has already been seen by 10 or 100 times as many people as will ever see the correction. This isn't a story about StatCounter being incompetent. It's a story about how an entire ecosystem of tech media, influencers, and casual sharers is structurally biased toward amplifying dramatic-sounding numbers first, and fact-checking them a distant second, if at all. It's worth understanding exactly what a user agent string is, and why it's such a fragile foundation for a statistic this consequential, because almost nobody outside of web development ever thinks about this tiny piece of text at all. Every time your browser requests a web page, it sends along a short line of text identifying itself. Something like Mozilla, Windows NT 10.0, Chrome, version number. Originally designed decades ago simply so websites could serve slightly different content to different browsers if needed. That string has always been self-reported by the browser itself, never independently verified by anything on the receiving end, which means its accuracy has always depended entirely on browsers choosing to report themselves honestly and completely. For most of the internet's history, that was a reasonably safe assumption. Browsers had little reason to lie about what they were, and websites had every reason to want accurate information. That assumption has been quietly breaking down for years, and 2026 is exactly the moment it appears to have broken down enough to distort a headline statistic this significant. Privacy-focused browsers and privacy-focused updates to mainstream browsers have increasingly started deliberately reducing how much detail gets included in that string, specifically to prevent websites from using it as one more data point. In building a unique fingerprint of any individual visitor, some browsers now report a generic, simplified version of their operating system rather than a precise one. Some strip version numbers entirely. Some randomize or freeze the reported information across updates specifically to prevent tracking. Every one of those changes is a genuinely reasonable privacy improvement for the person using that browser. And every one of those changes makes it marginally harder for a company like StatCounter to confidently sort that specific visit into the correct operating system category instead of dumping it into an ever-growing unknown pile. Now, here's the part of this story that genuinely matters. And it's the part almost every viral post about this completely ignored. Even after you strip out the unknown category entirely and calculate the fairest possible comparison, Windows is still losing ground, just not anywhere close to the apocalyptic scale the viral number implied. Comparing June 2025 to June 2026. Using that same recalculated methodology, Windows sat at 70.13% a year earlier, with the unknown category at a comparatively modest 9.17%. A year later, Windows sits at roughly 72% using the same adjusted math, but crucially, the unknown category itself has grown from 9.17% to 21.45% over that same 12 months. That growing chunk of unidentifiable traffic isn't nothing. Some meaningful portion of it likely does represent a real shift in browser, privacy behavior across every operating system, Windows included, and untangling exactly how much of that unknown bucket is secretly still Windows versus genuinely something else is not a problem anyone has fully solved yet. It's also worth being honest about a detail buried in that same dataset that should raise its own separate red flag about data quality here. That same June report showed OS X, a specific version of macOS that officially reached its end of life a full decade ago, back in 2016, supposedly representing nearly 12% of global desktop traffic on its own. Think about that claim for a second. Nearly 1 in 8 computers on the entire planet, supposedly still running a decade-old unsupported version of macOS that hasn't received a security update in 10 years, on a platform that pushes automatic updates aggressively, and where most users update within a version or two of release. That number isn't just implausible, it's close to nonsensical. And it's sitting right there in the exact same dataset that produced the viral Windows collapse headline, which should have been the second giant warning sign that something in this specific month's measurement methodology had gone seriously wrong well before any of the collapse headlines were ever published. If a data source is simultaneously claiming that Windows is collapsing and that a 10-year dead version of macOS commands nearly an eighth of the global desktop market. The honest, responsible conclusion isn't Windows is collapsing. It's something is wrong with how this specific month's data was classified, and any outlet that ran with the Windows headline while ignoring the equally absurd OS X figure sitting 2 rows above it in the exact same table was choosing the more exciting story over the more careful one. So let's actually answer the question. Everyone got wrong the first time around, using the most honest version of the numbers available. Windows did not fall below 60% of the global desktop market in June of 2026. That specific, viral, widely shared claim is false, and it has been directly, explicitly corrected by StatCounter's own recalculated data, independently verified by multiple outlets who did the actual arithmetic, rather than just screenshotting a headline number and moving on to the next. Post, Windows sits, by the fairest available reading of the data, somewhere around 72%, a real and continuing decline from previous years, but nowhere near the dramatic collapse that spread across social media for the better part of a week. That correction matters enormously for anyone whose entire understanding of the current state of the Windows versus Linux desktop battle got shaped by that one viral week. Because it's exactly the kind of story this channel has to be honest about, even when the more dramatic, false version would probably generate more views in the short term. We've spent this entire year documenting real, verified stories about Windows' genuine struggles. The Windows 10 end-of-support fallout, locking out working hardware, secure boot certificate transitions, quietly breaking dual boot systems, WSL failing developers, not once, but multiple times, a genuine, real, ongoing securities fraud lawsuit over Copilot's performance claims. Every one of those stories is real, documented and verifiable, built on sources that held up when checked against each other rather than a single screenshot passed around without scrutiny. This one isn't, and pretending otherwise, just because the number would have made an incredible headline, would be exactly the kind of dishonesty that erodes an audience's trust the moment they inevitably find out the real story on their own, usually from a competing channel more than happy to point out exactly where this one got it wrong. It's worth thinking about why this particular false number spread so much faster and further than its eventual correction ever will, because the mechanics here reveal something important about how to actually evaluate viral tech claims going forward, on this channel or anywhere else. The original number confirmed something a specific, engaged audience already wanted to believe. It required zero critical thinking to share, just a screenshot and a caption. And it arrived with the appearance of hard, authoritative data from a company whose name shows up constantly in legitimate tech journalism, which lent it a credibility the number never actually deserved once you looked one click deeper. The correction, by contrast, requires actually understanding what a user agent string is, why an unknown category exists in the first place, and doing a small piece of division. Most casual readers have no interest in performing themselves. Drama beats nuance in an attention economy every single time, and this specific story is about as clean an example of that dynamic as you're likely to find in tech reporting this year. There's a broader lesson buried in that dynamic that goes well beyond just this one statistic. It's worth naming directly because it applies to essentially every viral tech claim you'll ever encounter. The speed at which a number spreads has almost nothing to do with how accurate that number actually is. If anything, the relationship sometimes runs backward. The more dramatic and surprising a statistic sounds, the more likely it is to have skipped the careful verification step that a more boring, more plausible number would have received automatically, simply because nobody feels the same urgency to double-check a number that already sounds reasonable. A claim that Windows dropped 2 or 3 percentage points in a year would have barely registered as news at all. And precisely because of that, it probably would have been more carefully checked before publication than a claim dramatic enough to guarantee instant viral attention, regardless of whether anyone verified it first. If you take one practical lesson away from this whole episode, let it be this. Anytime you see a headline reporting a sudden, dramatic swing in market share data for any product, any platform, any company, check whether there's an unusually large unknown, other, or unclassified category sitting quietly in the same data set before you accept the headline number at face value. Download the raw data yourself if it's available, the way independent researchers did here. Ask what changed about the measurement methodology, not just what changed about the reported outcome. StatCounter's own data policy explicitly states that figures remain provisional and subject to revision for 45 days after publication, meaning even the numbers reported in the moment are, by the company's own admission, not the final word. A responsible reader and a responsible channel waits for that window to close, or at minimum flags the uncertainty clearly, rather than running with the most dramatic possible interpretation the instant it appears. That 45-day correction window is worth dwelling on for a second longer, because it means every single viral post. Sharing this number during that first week was, by the data provider's own stated policy, sharing information that hadn't even finished being verified yet. This wasn't a case of a company publishing bad final data. It was a case of an entire ecosystem of tech media and social media accounts treating provisional, actively still being corrected numbers as if they were finished, settled fact, simply because waiting even a few weeks for the dust to settle would have meant missing, out on being first to share the exciting version of the story. None of this means the underlying story of Linux's growth this year is fake. It isn't. Linux genuinely has been climbing steadily. Real government migrations in Germany, Denmark, and Switzerland are genuinely happening. And Windows 10's end-of-support deadline genuinely did push real, measurable numbers of users toward alternatives. All of that remains true and well documented, completely independent of this one specific viral statistic. What's fake is the idea that Windows suddenly catastrophically collapsed, below 60% in a single 2-month window in the middle of 2026. That specific claim was never real. In the honest version of this story, Windows still comfortably above 2/3 of the global desktop market, with a real, but far more, gradual decline happening underneath a mountain of increasingly unreliable browser tracking data is simply less exciting than the version that went viral. But it's the true one, and on this channel, that's always going to be the version we actually tell you. It's worth being honest about why this particular correction matters so much for a channel like this one specifically. Our entire premise, going back to the very first video we made about Windows 10 users switching to Linux, has been built on real numbers holding up to scrutiny. If we let one exciting, false number slide through uncorrected just because it flattered the narrative we've been building all year, every real number and every other video we've made becomes fair game for the same doubt. That's too high a price to pay for a single viral week of extra views on a number that was never true to begin with. Getting this one right, even though it means telling you Windows didn't actually collapse the way everyone hoped or feared, is exactly the kind of discipline that makes every other claim on this channel worth trusting. If you shared that original viral number yourself before finding out it was wrong, you're in good company. Plenty of tech outlets with far more resources than this channel got caught by it too, including sites that specifically cover Linux news and should arguably have been more careful given how directly the story flattered their own audience. Let me know in the comments if you remember seeing this story spread in real time and whether you noticed the unknown category before or after the correction came out. And if you want the fuller, accurate picture of everything that's actually been happening with Windows this year, the real Windows, 10 migration numbers, the genuine secure boot and WSL failures, the actual securities fraud lawsuit Microsoft is facing over Copilot, those videos are linked right here because those stories didn't need an exaggerated number to be genuinely shocking on their own. Every single fact in those videos was checked against multiple sources before it ever made it into a script. The exact same. Standard this video just held itself to. Subscribe if you want tech news that survives the fact check, not just the headline. Because in an ecosystem where a false number can circle the entire internet before its correction gets read by 1/10 as many people, that standard is worth more than ever.